Morning everyone. Just going to wait a couple of minutes before I get started on this week's talk. Hi Fiona. So welcome to this week's Learn With Lorna, and this is the 26th in the series. So before I go any further in talking about this week's subject, I'm going to start with the reminder that you'll all be used to by now if you've watched some of these, just to say that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, and that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to watch these films. But if you are in a position to be able to donate towards the work of the service, then we would very much appreciate that. So as I say, welcome to this week, the 26th in the Learn With Lorna series. Hello everyone who's saying hello really quickly this morning. That's I can't say hello to everybody back, I'm afraid, but hello everybody. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for the comments that came following last week's Learn With Lorna, which was looking at the Highland connection to the Caribbean slave plantation economy. I had some really nice messages from people about that talk and about the importance of covering the subjects. So I'm really glad that you enjoyed, and again, I'm using enjoyed advisedly. It's not quite the right word, but I'm glad that you felt it was a worthwhile talk last week, and I appreciated your comments. Now, as you know, we have the 4 offices within the Highland Archive Service. So we have our base hub centre in Inverness, the Highland Archive Centre, and then we have Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick, the Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William, and the Skye and Loch Alsh Archive Centre in Portree. And you'll know by now, if you've been watching some of these, that I'm trying to do some subjects that cover all of them and some that relate to the different offices. And so this week I'm looking at a collection that's held at the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness, but is relating to Nairnshire. The Highland Archive Centre covers the historic counties of Inverness-shire, Ross and Cromarty, Sutherland, Nairnshire, and little bits of Moray, but of course Moray have their own archive. So this one is relating mostly to Nairnshire. I hope that you've seen through the course of these talks that we have a lot of different uses for the collections that we look after, and that I am able to use them in different ways with different audiences, and so are the rest of the team. And so this week I'm going to talk about one that I often use with school groups, and as we go through it, you'll see why that is and why it's so relevant. We're looking at the story of Malcolm Blane today. So we touched on this in week 1 when we were looking at diaries as an overall subject, but I wanted to go into it in a bit more detail because it's a story that has everything. It has a lot of humour, it has tragedy in it, it has a lot of drama in it. It's a really interesting story that it's important that we tell. So I'm going to read a lot of quotes for this one, so you'll have to bear with me looking to the side from time to time. So this is the story, as I say, of Malcolm Blane. So he was born on the 7th of December 1892, so about 128 years ago. His father was a captain, and that becomes relevant. His father was Captain Gilbert Gordon Blane of the Scots Guards, and his mother was Mabel Augusta Stewart, and she was the granddaughter of the 8th Earl of Galloway. And that I tell you purely because it gives you an idea of the sort of family they were and the sort of circles they were moving in. He was their only son, Malcolm, but he had 3 sisters. So there was Malcolm, Miriam, Sheila, and Sylvia. His father inherited Fulgham Park in Windsor in 1885. And so the family lived there in a big estate in Windsor. And also they had a house in London, so they were sometimes in sort of Knightsbridge, Kensington area. Malcolm went to boarding school in Broadstairs. So he went to Stonehouse boarding school in Kent, in Broadstairs. And they spent their family summer and Christmas holidays in Nairn. And that's where the connection to the Highlands comes in. And they had, over the course of time, 2 houses. They had Westfield in Nairn, and they had Alton Don as well. So if you remember, a couple of weeks ago, I was talking about the Cameron of Lochiel collection, which is a huge, extensive collection of hundreds and hundreds of items covering hundreds of years. And And that's an example of a type of collection we care for. But also we care for collections like this, which have sort of 25-ish items in them. That's all there is in this collection. But there's such a huge story contained in those small number of things. So we're going to be looking at a couple of different things from this collection. Predominantly, we're going to be looking at Malcolm's diaries, Malcolm Blaine's diaries. We have 7 of his diaries dating from 1901 to 1905, and we have 2 diaries of his sister Sylvia dating from 1914 to 1915. And these were deposited with us in 1999, so we've had them for quite a while, and I believe that they were left in the house in Nairn and were handed in to us. They were found in the house, and someone said, would you be interested in looking after these? Again, as I have said several times through the course of this series, if you find anything in your house or your attic or your grand's spare room and that nobody needs anymore, please do contact us, because the danger otherwise is that these things get lost and these stories get lost. So Malcolm's diaries, one of the reasons I use them a lot with school groups is because they're written by a child, and that's so unusual for us to have. We really don't have a lot of children's voices within our collections. Then obviously there's a few reasons for that. Children, other than schoolwork, don't often generate a lot of written material unless they are of a particular interest in writing. And also the brutal fact is they are not often instrumental in the decision-making process. So, they don't appear in any of the big record collections we have, other than as a pupil or as a young family member. So that's something that's quite unusual about this diaries. The vast majority of this collection is written by children. Malcolm's diaries are full of all sorts of awesome things. So he writes stories and drawings and maps. He creates a language, which I love. It's using a mixture of sort of algebra and Greek and all sorts of things, and he uses different characters to create his own language and then writes in that. He writes plays, he writes about schoolwork, and I'm going to talk through some of those things and some of the amazing quotes that can be found in his diaries. So the first thing I want to talk about from the perspective of Malcolm's diaries is trains. So anyone who has looked at these diaries at all will know that Malcolm loved trains. And if you think about it, his life was spent moving between boarding school in Kent, home in London or Berkshire, holidays in the Highlands, and this is all 100 plus years ago, 120 years ago. So those journeys were undertaken by trains, and that was for him would associate a move between one part of life to another part of life. The trains are the things that escape him from school, take him on holiday. And so there's lots of mentions of trains in his diaries. If any of you saw the picture that I put up yesterday on our Facebook pages and our Twitter page, it's a map of the UK, and it's a map of the train that he took from London to Nairn. And he was aged 10 when he drew that map. And that's from volume 5 of his diaries. And there are many of these maps that appear through the diaries. And one thing I find extraordinary, a lot of children love to draw, but his maps are drawn to scale, and his maps are drawn to 2 scales. So he has 2 different scales depending on what he's looking at and how close in he wants to focus it. And you have to remember, as I say, he's age 10 at this point. The first page of the first diary is about a journey. And I'll read it to you. So the first opening page in big childish handwriting says, Malcolm Gilbert Stuart Blaine, Journey Book and Special Diary. Journey 1, made or done in about the month of July 1901, from Windsor to Nairn, leaving the Park Farm at Folgen in July, I've forgotten the exact date, for Nairn, North Britain, in the north of Scotland. And he was aged 8 when he wrote that. And his diaries mention all of the station names, all the times that they arrived in every station and when they departed. So, for instance, that first journey, he says, the journey took us 15 hours and 20 minutes. And then he breaks it down even further and says, so between King's Cross and Perth was 12 hours and 5 minutes. And then between Perth and Nairn was 3 hours, 15 minutes. And there are 28 stations that we. and he lists all the stations that they. And Fiona, you saying that you loved coming home on the sleeper, I did as well. My mum and dad are from London, and we used to go on the sleeper, and it was so exciting, like a different, you wake up in a different world. That first diary, that first journey that I'm describing, where he says he goes from Perth to Nairn in 28 stations, changing in Aviemore. That's the original Highland line. So that was the line that opened in 1863 and closed in 1965. So there's references in there to stations that don't exist anymore. And he talks about stopping in Granton, stopping in Dava, stopping at Boat of Garton, the same route that part of the Strathspey Steam Railway follows now. A year later, in 1902, there's an entry from August, and he would be age 9 at this point. And it's his kind of naivety in talking. You know, you wonder who he's writing these diaries for, but he's obviously writing them for an audience. And he says, "It was the most beautiful day, a fine and sunny day when we arrived in Nairn, and from the station we drove in a cab to our house Westfield. The Spey Valley is renowned in Scotland for its beautifulness. If you go there, you mind and look at the scenery." Scenery is spelt Seanery. But I am in no way criticising his writing or spelling, because he's quite extraordinary. As I say, he was 9 when he wrote that. So, and this is a favourite entry of mine. I have read it out loud several times this morning and have been in fits of laughter each time. So see what you think about this. He's writing about the coronation of King Edward VII in 1902 in August. And he says that there's a procession in Nairn. He gives the route. It began at 3 p.m. He gives the route through every street in Nairn that the procession followed for the coronation. But I love this. See what you think about this as a procession. The procession consisted of a lot of people in fancy dress on bicycles, a cart with a Highland bull in it, some farmers, some sheep and a sheepdog, the clergy of Nairn in 2 carriages, a band of pipers, 40 to 50 foresters, lots of gardeners of Nairn in their ordinary clothes, a band of volunteers in kilts, an enormous lifeboat with its crew dragged by horses, and a long procession of horses and cavalrymen, about 100 of them. And every time I've read that, I've just sort of thought, why are there hundreds of gardeners of Nairn walking down the street? It's an extraordinary idea for a procession, but as a child watching them all going past, quite extraordinary. And extraordinary to think that he took the time to remember it all, jot it all down in his diary. And so he loved his holidays in Nairn, and it's very, very clear in his diary how much they mean to him. And he often talks about going for adventures, going for expeditions, going for dangerous and exciting journeys. He talks about the King's yacht visiting, yacht spelt Y-O-T. He takes a train trip to Allenfern, but his great frustration, as you can imagine, for someone so passionate about trains, is that the man on the train wouldn't let him keep his ticket because they needed it for the accounting. And so he trawls about the ground until he finds another person's dropped ticket stub that he can take home and add to his diary. Again, in August 1902, on the 20th of August, he describes a trip to Fortrose. And again, I'll read it to you. As I say, I apologise that I'm looking away a lot and reading a lot, but I don't want to not do justice to the way he's chosen to write something. So he says, to Fortrose, North Britain, via Fort George, via Campbelltown. We reached Campbelltown at 4:25 p.m. At the Alma Hotel, we rested for 10 minutes and had some soda water. We sailed in a small boat in a rough sea for 60 yards from land, and then got into a sailing ship, which was a fair size. When we arrived at Fortrose Pier, we bicycled to Fortrose town, which was a mile up the hillside. When we got to the town, we went into a confectioner's shop where we had our tea and rested for an hour. At 6:40 p.m, we left the shop and bicycled downhill quickly to the ferry. Going home, we had to be rowed as there was no wind, and we arrived at Fort George at 7:20. Then we flew home as hard as ever we could go, and we saw the train coming through the trees from Inverness not very far off. We still had another mile to do. We tore and we rushed for our lives, and there we got alongside the station and rushed onto the platform. Oh no, the wrong side. The train that instant rushed in, and we ran across the line carrying our bicycles, and just got in with no tickets, of course, but just got in time, frantically hot, frantically tired. And again, he's like 9 when he's writing that. So I love the fact that not only is he having this adventure, but then he's writing about it in such detail. There are all sorts of descriptions of other day trips and other events. He draws a lovely plan of Urquhart Castle. He describes a trip down the Caledonian Canal, and again, that attention to detail. They go on the SS Caerlochi, and he says, we went past Dochgarach, we went past Dochfor, Loch Oich, Loch Ness, we went past Aldowrie. So he describes every place that they went past, every loch that they went through on the canal. And then what they had for lunch, boiled mutton, which he's very excited about being boiled mutton. And then sailing on to Banavie, and then getting the train to Fort William, and then getting the steamer to Oban, and staying overnight in the Great Western Hotel in Oban. So just a real passion for being alive and experiencing things. On a day trip to Banchory, he describes what they do there, and they walk over the bridge and they see the scenery and so on. But what I find just classically Malcolm about this is he gives the exact times of the trains, and so he's quite disappointed because they arrive exactly 2 minutes late. Arrived at 9:08, not ideal, 2 minutes late. And it's funny, these children still exist. My partner and I were on holiday down in London last year, and we saw a little child pressed up the window who was going, "It's East Canley or somewhere. It's this station." And then why have we got? Oh no, because this is this loop. So we go to this station next, and we were looking at each other, going, "That's a little Malcolm." Those children are still out there who are watching everything. So as I said, he talks a lot in his diaries about adventures, expeditions, journeys, and he talks about a day trip to the Old Bar, which is a sandbar just off the Nairn coast. And he describes this as another long and perilous journey. This is he and a couple of friends, and he says this is a long wished for trip that they've not been able to make before. And he describes how they cross the sand and try to avoid sinking in the mud. And it was sunset when we got back. He says we were freezing, we were late, and I had punctured my bike tyre and lost my stocking. A long wished for wonderful trip. Every time I look at him, find elements of the famous 5 elements of Just William about him, most definitely. So yeah, as I say, he loved his holidays, and that's very clear in his diaries. There's an extract from 1902 where he's leaving Nairn to go back to school, and it's the diary entry has some postcards of Nairn stuck into it, and his 9-year-old thoughts on leaving the area. And he says, "I've said to you before, I like to remember. It was a sad day, and yet a very excited one, happy with excitement also. How well I do remember waving away and saying goodbye, goodbye, goodbye to Nairn. See you again soon, I hope. Postcard 3 is of the railway bridge over the River Nairn on the forest side, taken from the moor. Here I end my account of my postcards." And he had written on the postcard, "My loving remembrance of Nairn." But, a 9-year-old, here I end my account. Obviously, he wasn't on holiday all the time. A large amount of his year was spent at school in Broadstairs. And again, this is another absolute top favourite Malcolm quote. Listen to this. So 1902, age 9, he says, "Really, I was quite astonished at how very, very quick indeed the 3rd week of school was. The slowness had quite gone, and now, on the 10th of October, I heartily love school, although I never thought I would half so much." And he's written that in capital letters, "I heartily love school." And that continues through his diaries. He writes a lot about the subject he's studying, updates on what they're learning in class, what their essay topics are. a lot about class ranking, where he sits in comparison with a couple of other boys, in particular one who they vie for being first, and you can tell it really irritates him. He's interested in the military, and that comes across in his diaries. And again, I mentioned at the beginning that his father was in the Scots Guards, so obviously there's that influence of a military family on him. He writes lectures in his diaries about the armies of the world, infantry regiments, what the cavalry do, what cannons can be used for, all sorts of different things. He writes about Wellington and Kitchener and Nelson. And when he's up on holiday, one time he goes across on the boat from Nairn to Invergordon to see the Channel Squadron moored at Invergordon at the naval base. And that's another lovely entry in his diary where he describes the journey going across the water. And he went on a visit with his school to learn about the old boys of his school who had died in battle. And he learns about their regimental flags and about what they had done serving their country and how proud the school was of them. And what's very noticeable for who is, a very adult and mature child is that he writes in his diary, they died in some war. So he doesn't really know where they've died, but he knows they've died and that the school is saddened and proud of them. I'm going to come on now and talk a little bit about his older life, his slightly older diaries, and then his adult life. But before I do that, just to do the middle reminder that this film is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that you don't need a subscription or to make any payment to watch these films. But if you're able to donate, then we would very much appreciate that. So that's him as a sort of 8, 9, 10-year-old. I'm going to read you now just an extract from a diary when he's just 1 or 2 years older. He's age 12. And that passion for words and writing and observing things is still very apparent, although the handwriting is very much more mature. And so he writes here, age 12. Again, it's on a train. It was a glorious sight all through the Grampian Mountains as the train suddenly pierced a thick bank of cloud and came out the other side. The snow was in large thick patches all over the ground, melted in some places. There was such a hard frost that early fine morning that the steam from the funnel rested in the air without evaporating. It could be seen like a long white line right down the valley for miles, zigzagging and moving about, winding over the rails. 12. When he's 13, he describes the journey back on the train from Nairn to London, and he describes going over the Forth Bridge, and he says it was in January, and he's describing that it's freezing cold, and everybody's fallen asleep except him, his mum, and the dog, I think. And he says, mother and I opened the window to look down through the dazzling girders of the Forth Bridge to the wash of the cold grey waves below. And then describes arriving in Edinburgh and looking at the spectacular Waverley Station and the castle. And again, really beautifully written. The final diary entry in the diaries that we hold is from the 19th of February 1905. I say the diaries we hold, I don't know if others exist. I would love to find out that somebody somewhere knows that there is more diaries. But certainly the diaries that we know end there in 1905. We know that when he finished at Stonehouse School, he went on to Eton, and then he went on to Christ Church College, Oxford. It's quite satisfying to know that he studied for a BA in civil engineering. He continued his passion and interest in trains and became, someone known for knowing about trains and having a knowledge of that, the network. While he was at university, he was in the University Officers Training Corps in the Cavalry Division. He was the founder of the Oxford University Gallic Society. He was president of the French Club. He was secretary of the Anglo-Grecian Club. So you can see that his love of words, linguistics, language, all of that continued. And then in spring 1914, age 21, he applied for a commission to serve with the Cameron Highlanders. And he applied to serve with the 3rd Battalion Cameron Highlanders, who were a reserve unit based in Inverness. So obviously that affiliation to the area was strong. And you'll remember at the beginning that I mentioned we have some diaries of his sister Sylvia. So as I said, Malcolm's diaries finished 1905, so we don't hear his own voice again. But we hear in his sister's diary. She writes on the 4th of August 1914, which is of course the day that Britain joined the First World War. She wrote, "The European war has begun. I'm glad that Mac's not a regular or very strong, otherwise he would want to go, although he would hate fighting the Germans." So he's signed up, she calls him Mac in the diaries, but she's grateful that he won't necessarily be going because he's in the reserve. But then on the 9th of May 1915, her diary just has 4 words in it. It says, "Malcolm's left for France." And that's all it says. And there's nothing more in her diary for over a week. And you can't help but think it's because she's coming to terms with that realisation that he's gone to France. So Malcolm landed in Boulogne on the 10th of May 1915. And he was killed in action on the first day of the Battle of Loos. 25th of September 1915. So 105 years ago tomorrow. And he was aged 22 when he died. He is commemorated on the Battle of Loos Memorial. Sorry, I know I probably look like I'm tearing up. You get to know the people in the collections in such depth that it's, you feel their loss when something happens to them. So he's commemorated on the Loos Memorial. He's commemorated in a stained glass window in St Columba's Church in Nairn. He appears on the Roll of Honour in Inverness Cathedral. And I would imagine, without a shadow of a doubt, that he also appears in other memorials in Berkshire or near his parents' home. Certainly there are references in Berkshire to him, to the family receiving the sympathy of the community. I said at the beginning that this is a story I often use with school groups. If you remember back to when Malcolm went with his school to learn about the people in his school that had fallen in previous wars, although goodness knows they had no idea what wars they were coming up to, but he says these were the old boys who died in some war. And I think it's absolutely inevitable that with the passage of time, you lose the emotional strength of the connection. You lose the knowledge of those people and what the war was and what that meant. And so I think for a lot of people, a lot of children, the First World War was a long time ago. They know it's really important, but basically these are some people who died in some war until they understand it more. And so the reason I often use the story of Malcolm Blaine with school groups is because the children then get to know a child and get to love a child and get to see all his adventures and his fun, and then learn what happened to him. And then if you learn that about one person, then you can start to understand those massive figures of loss of life and the fact that each of them has a story. Maybe all of them had a sister at home writing a diary, devastated. And that's why diaries are so important. And that's why if any of you took up our call initially to keep diaries during the COVID lockdown, please do carry on with that, and please contact us if you've got diaries that will be of interest to us, because your story, whether it's big or small or whatever your story is important, and it's important that we keep that for the future. I'd like to round off by reading a poem. In 2016, I did my first creative writing project with the Archive Service, and you'll have heard me speak several times over the weeks about projects I've done with Milburn Academy and with some other schools using archive material to inspire creative writing. And so, sorry, I'm still Malcolm sniffing. So I started this project in 2016, and a result of this was a gentleman called Philip Dunford handed in a series of poems inspired by different documents that I'd had out on display. So this, when I did it the first time, we had adults doing creative writing, we had schools, primary schools, secondary schools. And this was a piece of writing that Philip Dunford produced, inspired by Malcolm's diaries. And I just feel, however I round off, I probably won't be able to beat the way Philip Dunford has worded this in response to looking at the original material. So I would like to read it to you. If you enjoy this poem and you want to look at it again, it is on Ambala. So please do feel free to Google our Ambala website and you'll see it on there. So it's called Diary 1903. This book, the pages rush open as if on springs. The title says, "This is my diary. I'm Malcolm Blaine. I'm 10. It's not a chore. This life is like no other. The world is the most exciting changing room there's ever been. I'm already on volume number 6. 500 pages, rich a year to wonder. It's not a slim back pocket slip. It requires a satchel. My life is crammed with pantomimes and sport, lectures on Jerusalem, Armenia, and nature expeditions as well. My drawing of a woodpecker, stout, starched, stooped, squawks in colour. I feel my life's expectation, schoolboy dreams, school in Kent, holidays in Nairn, trips to foreign climes. Today a boat trip to Invergordon, dwarfed by the suitors, glimpse Beauchard's kidnapping cave. The sheltering grasp opens for an escorting man of war. I'm so small compared to HMS Magnificent. I climb aboard, 12-inch guns, 60 tons, a giant grey steel climbing frame. Excitement gawps up slender vertical ladders. No rails to the peaks, exhilarate, hungry and dangerous. Look down on 400 feet of hand-calloused, scrubbed imperial power. Polished teak and brass, over 600 crew busily and below. But the Great War did not have time to read these words. Found no excuse on grounds of brimming talent. That youthfulness in reams. For Lieutenant Malcolm Blane of the Cameron Highlanders, there will not even be ashes to scatter from an urn, just a neat plaque, not far from where he fell, but so much more. We're fortunate that minds cannot escape the harsh beauty of their times without leaving writing. I think that's such a beautiful piece of writing. I really do. The image of the diary bursting with life, and then the war not bothering to read those stories and just cutting people down, I think is very descriptive. I'm going to round off there by saying I hope you can join me next week. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about Malcolm's life and realising, as many of you will of course know, that he is just one of so many millions who fell in that conflict and the subsequent conflicts. I hope you can join me next week. I'll be looking, after a lot of demand from people, at more stories from our asylum records. Some of the people who were in the asylum, some of the people who worked there, and things that happened in that building, which are historically not all bad. I'm going to round off by saying, as I always do, that these series of films are brought to you by High Life Highland, and that there's no charge to the viewer to take part in them. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these films. If you're able to donate to allow us to keep protecting and sharing these collections, then we would really appreciate that. And if you want to view this film or any of the earlier films back, they're all available on Facebook, and they're all available on the High Life Highland YouTube channel. So I hope that you're able to do that. And thank you for all your messages coming in. I'm really glad you've enjoyed hearing Malcolm's story.